Captain Sarah Phoenix Martinez stood in the dimly lit hangar at Edwards Air Force Base, watching Colonel James Reeves dismiss her flight recommendation with that same contemptuous look he'd perfected over the years. "Women pilots are a liability." In extreme weather conditions, he'd said just hours earlier during the mission briefing, his voice carrying across the room loud enough for every aviator present to hear. They don't have the physical strength or mental fortitude to handle the kind of flying this operation requires. What he didn't know was that in less than 12 hours, she'd be piloting the most dangerous rescue mission in Air Force history through a Category 4 hurricane to extract his stranded reconnaissance team from a collapsing oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico, proving that sometimes the person you leave for dead becomes the only one who can bring you home alive. The October wind howled across the California desert, rattling the massive hangar doors as maintenance crews worked on the fleet of aircraft that represented America's most advanced aerial capabilities. The scent of jet fuel mixed with hydraulic fluid created an atmosphere that spoke of precision, engineering, and split-second decisions where the margin for error measured in milliseconds rather than minutes. This was Edwards Air Force Base, home to test pilots who pushed the boundaries of what was humanly possible in machines, designed to defy the laws of physics. In this environment, where respect was earned through stick and rudder skills rather than politics or connections, Sarah had spent the last 3 years rebuilding a reputation that had been systematically destroyed by the very people who now questioned her abilities. Her call sign, Phoenix, hadn't been chosen randomly. It represented her rise from the ashes of a career that others had left for dead in the mountains of Afghanistan a decade earlier. The mission briefing had revealed a crisis developing in real time off the Louisiana coast. Hurricane Helena, a massive Category 4 storm with sustained winds exceeding 150 miles per hour, was bearing down on a deep-water oil platform where a classified reconnaissance operation had gone catastrophically wrong. The 6-person team, led by Colonel Reeves himself, had been conducting intelligence gathering on suspected terrorist activities when their extraction helicopter had been forced down by the storm's outer bands. Now they were trapped on platform Delta 7, a drilling rig that was taking structural damage from 20-foot waves and hurricane-force winds. Weather reports indicated the platform's integrity was compromised, with complete collapse expected within 18 hours as the storm's eye wall approached their position. Standard rescue protocols called for waiting until the hurricane passed. But meteorological data showed Helena was moving slowly and would batter the platform for at least 36 hours, far longer than the structure could survive. Sarah had studied the weather patterns and platform specifications during the briefing, immediately identifying a narrow window of opportunity that could allow a helicopter rescue during the storm's passage. Her analysis indicated that flying at extremely low altitude through the hurricane's spiral bands could potentially reach the platform, but it would require piloting skills that pushed beyond normal safety parameters and into the realm of controlled catastrophe. When she'd presented her tactical assessment to the assembled officers, outlining a flight path that utilized the storm's own wind patterns to provide lift assistance while avoiding the most dangerous downdrafts, Colonel Reeves had responded with open mockery. "This isn't some video game simulation, Martinez," he'd sighed, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension that had become his trademark whenever addressing female pilots. "Real hurricane flying requires physical strength that women simply don't possess. The control inputs needed to maintain aircraft stability in those conditions would exhaust most male pilots within minutes." Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this content, please hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications. It really helps the channel grow. The other aviators in the briefing room had shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, but none had spoken up to challenge Reeves's assessment. In the rigid hierarchy of military aviation, questioning a senior officer's judgment about pilot capabilities was considered career suicide. even when that judgment was obviously based on prejudice rather than professional evaluation. The unspoken rule was that challenging authority, regardless of how wrong that authority might be, marked an officer as unreliable and unsuitable for advancement. Sarah had maintained her professional composure throughout Reeves's dismissal, though every fiber of her being wanted to remind him of exactly who had been flying rescue missions in Afghanistan, while he was safely stationed at Pentagon desk assignments. Instead, she'd quietly returned to her position at the back of the briefing room, listening as other pilots presented alternative approaches that were either tactically impossible or would arrive too late to matter. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. 10 years ago, Colonel Reeves had been a major serving as operations officer for a forward operating base in Helmand Province, where Sarah had been assigned as a helicopter pilot supporting special operations missions. During her deployment, she'd earned a reputation for successfully completing extractions under conditions that other pilots considered impossible, including night rescues through mountainous terrain under enemy fire. But her career had been destroyed by a single mission where political considerations had overruled tactical judgment, leaving her stranded behind enemy lines while Reeves and others had chosen political expedience over loyalty to fellow service members. The official report had blamed pilot error for the mission failure, though anyone with actual combat experience understood that she'd been set up to fail by commanders who saw her success as a threat to established order. Now, a decade later, those same commanders were facing a crisis that required exactly the kind of extreme weather flying that Sarah had mastered during her years of exile from mainstream military aviation. After being medically retired from active duty following injuries sustained during her abandonment in Afghanistan, she'd spent years working as a civilian test pilot and emergency services aviator, developing skills in extreme weather operations that exceeded anything taught in standard military training programs. Her civilian flying experience had included hurricane reconnaissance missions with the National Hurricane Center, where she'd learned to read storm patterns and wind dynamics in ways that allowed navigation through weather systems that would destroy conventional aircraft operations. She'd also worked with offshore oil companies, conducting medical evacuations from drilling platforms during severe weather events that tested both pilot skill and aircraft capabilities to their absolute limits. The helicopter she'd been assigned for this potential rescue mission was an MH-60T Jayhawk, a specialized variant designed for all-weather operations in maritime environments. The aircraft represented the pinnacle of search and rescue technology, equipped with advanced navigation systems, weather radar, and structural modifications that allowed operation in conditions that would ground standard helicopters. However, even the Jayhawk's capabilities had limits, and flying through a Category 4 hurricane would push every system beyond normal operational parameters. Sarah had spent the afternoon conducting pre-flight inspections and reviewing weather data, calculating fuel consumption rates and power requirements for the kind of flying that would be necessary to reach Platform Delta 7. Her analysis indicated that the mission was technically possible, but would require constant adjustments to power settings, flight attitude, and navigation inputs that would demand absolute concentration for the entire duration of the flight. The weather briefing had painted a picture of meteorological violence that exceeded most pilots' experience. Hurricane Helena's eyewall contained wind speeds approaching 180 miles per hour, with embedded supercells that could generate downdrafts exceeding 3,000 feet per minute. Flying through such conditions would subject both aircraft and pilot to forces that could cause structural failure or complete loss of control within seconds, if not properly managed. But Sarah's experience with extreme weather operations had taught her that hurricanes, despite their apparent chaos, followed predictable patterns that could be exploited by pilots with sufficient skill and understanding of atmospheric dynamics. The key was reading the storm's structure and timing movements to coincide with brief windows of relative stability that occurred between the most violent spiral bands. As evening approached and Hurricane Helene continued its relentless advance toward the Gulf Coast, weather reports confirmed that Platform Delta 7 was taking increasingly severe damage from wind and waves. The reconnaissance team's last communication had indicated that several platform support structures had failed, and that complete collapse was expected well before dawn. Time was running out for any rescue attempt, conventional or otherwise. The base operations center buzzed with activity as meteorologists, flight planners, and senior officers struggled to develop alternative rescue scenarios. Every conventional approach had been evaluated and found inadequate, given the storm's intensity and the platform's deteriorating condition. The conclusion was becoming unavoidable. Either someone attempted a rescue flight through the hurricane, or 6 Air Force personnel would die when the platform collapsed. Colonel Reeves stood at the center of the operations center, his earlier confidence replaced by the hollow stare of an officer whose decisions had placed his people in an impossible situation. The reconnaissance mission he'd insisted on conducting, despite weather warnings, had now trapped his entire team in a scenario where their survival depended on the kind of flying he'd publicly declared impossible for female pilots. Sarah watched from her position near the communications console as desperate radio transmissions arrived from Platform Delta 7. The voices of trapped personnel carried barely controlled panic as they described platform sections breaking away under the hurricane's assault. Their situation reports painted a picture of men who understood they were facing imminent death unless someone was willing to attempt what appeared to be a suicide mission. The mathematical reality of the rescue scenario was brutally simple. Standard rescue protocols required waiting for weather conditions to improve, but the platform wouldn't survive long enough for conditions to improve. Launching a rescue mission in current weather violated every safety regulation in military aviation, but not launching meant accepting the certain death of 6 Air Force personnel who were counting on their service to bring them home. Weather radar displays showed Hurricane Helene as a massive spiral of destruction covering hundreds of square miles, with Platform Delta 7 positioned directly in the path of the storm's most violent quadrant. Meteorological analysis indicated that wind speeds at the platform location would continue increasing for the next 12 hours before reaching their peak intensity. Any rescue attempt would have to be launched soon, or the window of possibility would close permanently. The weight of command decisions pressed down on everyone in the operations center as senior officers realized they were facing a choice between probable disaster and certain tragedy. Launching an unauthorized rescue mission could result in court-martial proceedings for everyone involved, but standing by while recoverable personnel died violated the fundamental principles of military service. Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her stomach that always preceded missions where success depended more on skill than luck. She'd experienced this feeling before during her deployment to Afghanistan, when political calculations had ultimately led to her abandonment by the same people who now needed her expertise to survive. The irony was bitter but undeniable. Her civilian experience with extreme weather operations had made her the only pilot on base capable of attempting what needed to be done. The Gulf of Mexico stretched endlessly beyond the Louisiana coastline. Its normally azure waters transformed into a churning cauldron of gray and white as Hurricane Helene's outer bands lashed the offshore drilling platforms with increasing fury. This was America's energy lifeline, where massive steel structures rose from the ocean floor like industrial monuments to human ambition, each one representing billions of dollars in infrastructure and the livelihoods of thousands of workers who kept the nation's oil flowing. Platform Delta 7 sat 43 nautical miles from shore, positioned in waters nearly 300 feet deep where the continental shelf dropped away into the abyss of the central Gulf. The platform was a marvel of engineering, designed to withstand hurricane-force winds and 30-foot waves while maintaining operations that extracted crude oil from reservoirs buried 2 miles beneath the seafloor. Its massive legs, each one wider than a city bus, were anchored to the ocean bottom with foundations that had been calculated to survive the worst storms the Gulf could produce. But Hurricane Helene was rewriting the mathematical assumptions that governed offshore platform design. Weather buoys positioned throughout the Gulf were recording wave heights exceeding 40 feet, with individual swells reaching nearly 60 feet as the storm's energy focused into increasingly violent pulses that hammered every structure in their path. The platform's sophisticated motion sensors indicated structural stress levels, approaching the limits of what the installation could absorb while maintaining its integrity. In this environment, where the margin between survival and catastrophe, measured in degrees of structural tolerance and minutes of response time, every decision carried life or death consequences that extended far beyond the immediate personnel at risk. The Gulf's offshore installations employed more than 50,000 workers during normal operations, making emergency response procedures a critical component of both corporate liability and national energy security. When disasters struck, the difference between successful rescue operations and catastrophic loss of life often depended on the willingness of aviation personnel to operate beyond normal safety parameters. The reconnaissance mission that had placed Colonel Reeves and his team in their current predicament was part of a classified intelligence operation that had been monitoring suspected terrorist activities among offshore contract workers. Intelligence reports had suggested that foreign operatives were attempting to infiltrate oil platform operations as part of a larger plot to disrupt American energy infrastructure, making surveillance of key installations a matter of national security rather than routine law enforcement. The mission had been planned during a brief weather window between storm systems, when meteorological forecasts suggested sufficient time to complete intelligence gathering and extraction before Hurricane Helene's arrival. However, the storm had intensified more rapidly than predicted, catching the reconnaissance team in position when their planned extraction helicopter was forced to abort its approach due to deteriorating weather conditions that exceeded safe operating limits for standard rescue aircraft. Military aviation in the Gulf region operated under a complex web of regulations and protocols that balanced operational necessity against the inherent dangers of flying over open water in variable weather conditions. Search and rescue operations were coordinated between multiple agencies, including the Coast Guard, Air Force, Navy, and civilian contractors who specialized in offshore emergency response. Each organization brought specific capabilities and limitations that had to be integrated into comprehensive rescue plans during crisis situations. The standard approach to hurricane-related emergencies involved pre-positioning rescue assets at inland facilities where they could respond rapidly once weather conditions improved to acceptable safety levels. This strategy worked well for most scenarios, but failed catastrophically when the timeline for structural collapse occurred faster than the timeline for weather improvement. Current protocols assumed that offshore installations could survive hurricane passage, making immediate rescue unnecessary during the storm's most violent phases. However, Platform Delta 7 structural engineers had been transmitting increasingly alarming reports about the installation's condition as Hurricane Helene's intensity continued to exceed design parameters. Computer models indicated that several critical support members had sustained damage that compromised the platform's ability to withstand continued battering from wind and waves. The mathematical projections were clear. Complete structural failure would occur well before the hurricane passed and normal rescue operations could be safely conducted. Edwards Air Force Base served as the primary testing facility for advanced aviation technologies that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible in military flight operations. Test pilots stationed at Edwards routinely flew experimental aircraft through conditions that would be considered suicidal in operational squadrons, developing techniques and procedures that eventually became standard practice throughout the aviation community. The base's culture emphasized innovation and calculated risk-taking as essential components of maintaining America's technological superiority in aerospace operations. The MH-60T Jayhawk helicopters stationed at Edwards represented the pinnacle of all-weather rescue technology, incorporating decades of engineering advancement in power plant design, flight control systems, and structural integrity. These aircraft were specifically configured for operations in extreme environmental conditions, including hurricane-force winds, icing conditions, and severe turbulence that would destroy conventional helicopters. However, even the Jayhawks' capabilities had never been tested in the kind of sustained hurricane environment that would be required to reach Platform Delta-7. Weather reconnaissance data from Hurricane Helene painted a picture of atmospheric violence that challenged fundamental assumptions about aircraft survivability in extreme conditions. The storm's eye wall contained wind speeds that fluctuated rapidly between 150 and 180 miles per hour, creating shear forces that could tear aircraft apart within seconds if encountered at the wrong altitude or angle. Embedded within the hurricanes, spiral bands were supercells capable of generating tornadoes, microbursts, and hail that posed additional threats to any aircraft attempting to penetrate the storm system. The physics of helicopter flight in hurricane conditions involved complex interactions between rotor disk loading, power requirements, and control authority that pushed aircraft systems to their absolute limits. Maintaining stable flight required constant adjustments to collective and cyclic controls as wind conditions changed from second to second, demanding pilot workload that exceeded normal human endurance capabilities. The margin for error in such conditions measured in milliseconds, where momentary inattention or control input delay could result in immediate loss of control and catastrophic ground impact. Navigation through hurricane systems required understanding of atmospheric dynamics that went far beyond standard aviation weather training. Storm penetration involved reading wind patterns, pressure gradients, and precipitation cores to identify brief windows of relative stability that could be exploited for forward progress. The key was timing movements to coincide with temporary lulls between the most violent atmospheric disturbances, while maintaining situational awareness of rapidly changing conditions that could eliminate safe escape routes without warning. Military command structure demanded clear chains of authority and responsibility that became complicated during emergency situations where standard procedures proved inadequate for evolving circumstances. Senior officers were trained to make decisions based on established protocols and risk assessments that balanced mission accomplishment against personnel safety. However, situations like Hurricane Helene or rescue operations fell outside normal parameters, requiring command decisions that involved accepting either probable disaster or certain tragedy with no middle ground for compromise. Edwards Air Force Base Operations Center functioned as the nerve center for coordinating complex flight operations that often involved multiple aircraft, agencies, and objectives simultaneously. The facility's sophisticated communication systems could maintain contact with aircraft operating anywhere in North America, while advanced weather monitoring capabilities provided real-time atmospheric data that enabled precise flight planning and route adjustment during dynamic conditions. Captain Sarah Martinez's service record read like a catalog of aviation excellence that few pilots could match even after decades of flying. She had graduated first in her class from the United States Air Force Academy, where her aeronautical engineering thesis on helicopter performance in extreme weather conditions had been classified and incorporated into advanced flight training curricula. Her academic achievements included a master's degree in atmospheric physics from MIT, completed during the prestigious military fellowship that identified her as one of the Air Force's most promising young officers. Flight school at Fort Rucker had been where Sarah's natural flying ability first distinguished her from her peers. She completed the demanding helicopter pilot training program in record time, while achieving perfect scores on every phase check and evaluation flight. Her instructors noted an almost supernatural ability to read aircraft systems and weather conditions, allowing her to anticipate problems before they developed and execute recovery procedures with precision that suggested years of experience rather than initial training. Her initial assignment to the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment had placed her among the military's most elite helicopter pilots, where she flew classified missions supporting Delta Force and Navy SEAL operations in some of the world's most dangerous environments. During her first deployment to Iraq, she completed over 200 combat missions without a single aircraft incident or mission failure, earning recognition as one of the regiment's most reliable pilots for high-risk extractions and insertions behind enemy lines. The transition to Afghanistan had tested Sarah's skills in an entirely different operational environment, where mountainous terrain and unpredictable weather created challenges that required constant adaptation of flying techniques. She mastered the art of high-altitude operations where thin air reduced engine performance and rotor efficiency, learning to extract maximum capability from aircraft operating at the edge of their performance envelope. Her mission success rate remained perfect even when assigned the most dangerous operations that other pilots considered beyond acceptable risk levels. Hurricane penetration flying represented a specialized skill set that Sarah had developed during off-duty training with the National Hurricane Center's Research Division. She volunteered for weather reconnaissance missions that required flying directly into developing storm systems to gather atmospheric data that improved forecasting accuracy. These flights exposed her to wind conditions and turbulence levels that exceeded anything encountered in normal military operations, teaching her to read storm dynamics and maintain aircraft control in situations where most pilots would lose spatial orientation within minutes. Her work with offshore oil companies had provided extensive experience in maritime helicopter operations under extreme weather conditions. Sarah had conducted medical evacuations from drilling platforms during severe storms, navigating through fog, rain, and high winds while maintaining precise positioning over moving targets. These civilian operations taught her to understand ocean wind patterns and how they interacted with helicopter flight characteristics, knowledge that proved invaluable when conducting rescues in dynamic maritime environments. Advanced instrument flying qualifications included certifications in every weather condition the Federal Aviation Administration could simulate, from severe icing encounters to Category I instrument approaches in zero visibility conditions. Sarah had logged over 3,000 hours of actual instrument flight time, including extensive experience in embedded thunderstorms and severe turbulence that tested both pilot skill and aircraft structural limits. Her reputation among civilian aviation circles was that of a pilot who could safely navigate conditions that would ground most commercial operators. Combat search and rescue operations in Afghanistan had exposed Sarah to scenarios where successful mission completion required flying beyond published aircraft limitations and safety parameters. She developed techniques for operating helicopters in mountainous terrain during nighttime conditions with degraded visibility, using night vision systems and terrain-following navigation to extract wounded personnel from locations that conventional rescue operations couldn't reach. Her innovation in extreme environment flying contributed to tactical procedures that saved dozens of lives during her deployment. Medical training at the Air Force's Aerospace Medicine School had provided Sarah with advanced understanding of human physiological responses to extreme stress and environmental conditions. She learned to recognize and counteract the effects of spatial disorientation, hypoxia, and G-force loading that could impair pilot decision-making during critical flight phases. This knowledge proved essential during demanding missions where maintaining cognitive function under physical stress often determined the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Test pilot qualifications earned at Edwards Air Force Base represented the highest level of aviation expertise recognized by the military establishment. Sarah had successfully completed the demanding test pilot school curriculum that combined advanced aeronautical engineering with experimental flying techniques. Her test pilot work included first flights of prototype aircraft and evaluation of new flight control systems under conditions designed to reveal potential failure modes before aircraft entered operational service. Foreign military exchange programs had provided Sarah with experience flying international aircraft types and operating under different national aviation regulations and procedures. She completed advanced training with the Royal Air Force's Search and Rescue Squadron, learning European approaches to maritime helicopter operations that emphasize different techniques for weather penetration and precision navigation. These international qualifications expanded her understanding of alternative methods for accomplishing missions that American training might consider impossible. Civilian emergency medical services flying had occupied Sarah's time during military leave periods, where she volunteered with hospital helicopter programs that transported critical patients between medical facilities. This work required precise flying in urban environments with complex obstacle clearance requirements, often during weather conditions that challenged visual flight rules. Her experience with medical evacuation operations provided intimate knowledge of patient care requirements during flight, including understanding of how aircraft motion and environmental factors affected critically injured personnel. Alpine rescue operations with civilian mountain rescue organizations had tested Sarah's flying skills in some of the most demanding environments possible for helicopter operations. She learned to conduct precision hovering at high altitudes where engine performance was marginal, often in close proximity to terrain features that created severe downdrafts and wind shear conditions. These operations required split-second decision-making and aircraft control inputs that exceeded the precision demanded by normal military flying. Instructor pilot qualifications at multiple levels demonstrated Sarah's ability to transfer complex flying skills to other aviators while maintaining safety standards during training operations. She had trained dozens of military pilots in advanced weather flying techniques, developing instructional methods that accelerated learning curves and reduced training accidents. Her students consistently achieved higher success rates in difficult flying conditions than graduates from conventional training programs. Engineering test flying had involved evaluating aircraft modifications and new equipment installations under controlled conditions that simulated operational stresses. Sarah's background in aeronautical engineering allowed her to understand the theoretical performance limits of aircraft systems and how those limits translated into practical flying constraints. This knowledge enabled her to safely explore aircraft capabilities while providing meaningful feedback to engineers about system performance under real-world conditions. Colonel James Reeves had built his 22-year Air Force career on the way foundation of traditional military hierarchy and the unspoken belief that combat aviation was fundamentally a masculine domain where physical strength and aggressive leadership determined success. His background reflected the conventional path of a career officer who had advanced through administrative competence rather than exceptional flying ability, accumulating promotions through staff assignments that kept him safely distant from the kind of dangerous operations that actually tested pilot skills under extreme conditions. His formative years as a young lieutenant had been spent at peaceful European bases during the final years of the Cold War, where flying consisted primarily of routine training missions and ceremonial formations that emphasized precision over combat readiness. Reeves had never been forced to adapt to rapidly changing tactical situations or demonstrate the kind of innovative thinking that characterized pilots who excelled in actual combat environments. Instead, he learned to navigate bureaucratic systems, and cultivate relationships with senior officers who valued political reliability over operational expertise. The transition to the post-Cold War military had found Reeves perfectly positioned to advance through intelligence and planning positions that required administrative skills rather than flying competence. His assignments included tours at the Pentagon, NATO headquarters, and various joint staff positions where success was measured by the ability to coordinate between different organizations and manage complex logistical requirements. These experiences taught him to view military operations through the lens of policy implementation rather than tactical innovation. Reeves's first exposure to female combat pilots had occurred during his assignment as operations officer at a training base where women were beginning to enter previously male-dominated aviation specialties. His reaction was typical of many career officers who viewed integration as a political experiment that threatened established military culture rather than an opportunity to expand the talent pool available for dangerous missions. He developed a pattern of subtle discrimination that questioned female pilots' physical capabilities while avoiding explicit statements that could trigger formal complaints. His deployment to Afghanistan as a major had been carefully managed to minimize personal risk while maximizing career advancement opportunities. Reeves served as operations officer for a forward operating base that conducted primarily administrative and logistical functions, allowing him to earn combat deployment credit without exposure to the kind of direct action missions that tested leadership under fire. His role involved coordinating between higher headquarters and subordinate units rather than making tactical decisions that could result in immediate life or death consequences. The incident that had destroyed Sarah Martinez's career 10 years earlier had originated from Reeves's risk-averse approach to mission planning and his willingness to sacrifice subordinate personnel when political considerations conflicted with operational loyalty. When a special operations mission had gone wrong due to intelligence failures and poor weather planning, Reeves had chosen to protect his own career by ensuring that blame fell on the helicopter pilot rather than the staff officers whose inadequate preparation had created the disaster. Reeves had systematically constructed a narrative that portrayed the mission failure as pilot error rather than command negligence, despite knowing that Sarah Martinez had performed heroically under impossible conditions created by his own planning deficiencies. His willingness to destroy an exceptional pilot's career to protect his advancement reflected a moral character that prioritized personal ambition over military values. The official investigation had accepted his version of events because challenging a field-grade officer's assessment would have implied broader command failures that senior leaders preferred to avoid. His subsequent promotions had been facilitated by Reeves's reputation as a reliable administrator who could manage complex operations without creating political problems for his superiors. He learned to identify and exploit institutional biases that favored conventional thinking over innovative approaches, positioning himself as a steady leader who could be trusted with increasing levels of responsibility. His advancement through lieutenant colonel to full colonel had been steady and unremarkable, reflecting competence in staff functions rather than exceptional performance in operational roles. The pattern of discrimination that Reeves had established against female aviators had become increasingly sophisticated over the years, evolving from crude comments about physical limitations to more subtle questioning of judgment and decision-making capabilities. He had learned to frame his objections in terms of unit cohesion and mission effectiveness rather than explicit gender bias, making his prejudice more difficult to challenge through formal channels. His influence over junior officers created an environment where questioning his assessments of female pilots was considered inappropriate and potentially career-damaging. Reeves's approach to risk management reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of how successful aviation operations balanced safety concerns against mission requirements. His conservative interpretation of safety regulations often prevented units under his command from attempting missions that more experienced pilots considered routine, while his emphasis on avoiding any possibility of failure sometimes resulted in missed opportunities to accomplish important objectives. He had never learned to distinguish between prudent caution and paralyzing risk aversion. His current assignment as wing operations officer at Edwards Air Force Base had placed him in position to influence testing and evaluation programs that determined which aircraft modifications and tactical procedures would be adopted throughout the Air Force. Reeves used this authority to promote conventional approaches that reinforced existing institutional preferences while blocking innovations that challenged traditional assumptions about pilot capabilities. His resistance to change had slowed adoption of several technological improvements that could have enhanced mission effectiveness. The intelligence operation that had led to his current predicament on platform Delta 7 represented exactly the kind of mission where Reeves's administrative background proved inadequate for dealing with rapidly evolving tactical situations. He had insisted on conducting the reconnaissance despite weather warnings, because postponement would have reflected poorly on his planning capabilities, prioritizing his professional reputation over the safety of personnel under his command. His refusal to consider alternative approaches suggested by more experienced operators had eliminated options that might have prevented the current crisis. Reeves's leadership style during the mission had emphasized rigid adherence to predetermined plans rather than adapting to changing conditions that required flexible thinking and innovative solutions. When the extraction helicopter had been forced to abort due to deteriorating weather, he had refused to consider immediate evacuation options that might have gotten his team off the platform before Hurricane Helena's arrival. His insistence on following standard procedures had trapped 6 people in a situation where standard procedures were inadequate for survival. The psychological pressure of command responsibility was revealing aspects of Reeves's character that had been concealed during his staff assignments and administrative roles. Faced with the immediate prospect of losing personnel due to his own decision-making failures, he was experiencing the kind of stress that separated competent administrators from effective combat leaders. His previous confidence in his judgment was crumbling as the consequences of his choices became undeniably clear. Reeves's current radio transmissions from platform Delta 7 reflected a commander who had lost confidence in his ability to control the situation through conventional means. His requests for immediate reinforcement and close air support demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of what was operationally possible during hurricane conditions. He was calling for responses that could not be provided while refusing to acknowledge that survival might require accepting help from the pilot he had spent years undermining. This morning's mission briefing at Edwards Air Force Base had been particularly humiliating for Sarah, representing the culmination of years of systematic exclusion from operations that matched her qualifications and experience. The briefing room had been packed with the base's most senior aviators, intelligence officers, and operational planners, all gathered to address the developing crisis in the Gulf of Mexico, where Hurricane Helena threatened multiple offshore installations, and the personnel stationed on them. Sarah had arrived early to review the meteorological data and platform specifications, immediately recognizing patterns in the storm structure that suggested potential flight paths through the hurricane's spiral bands. Her analysis of wind velocities, pressure gradients, and precipitation cores had revealed brief windows of relative stability that could potentially be exploited by a pilot with sufficient experience in extreme weather operations. She had prepared detailed calculations showing fuel consumption rates, power requirements, and navigation waypoints that would allow a rescue helicopter to reach platform Delta 7, despite the hurricane's intensity. When Colonel Reeves had called for tactical input from the assembled aviators, Sarah had presented her findings with the kind of professional precision that had characterized her military career. Her presentation included computer-generated flight profiles, risk assessments, and contingency procedures that demonstrated thorough understanding of both hurricane dynamics and helicopter performance limitations. She had outlined a mission profile that acknowledged the extreme dangers involved, while providing a realistic path to mission accomplishment that could save 6 lives. Reeves's response had been swift and devastating, delivered with the kind of public humiliation that was designed to discourage future challenges to his authority. "Martinez, this isn't some civilian airshow stunt flying," he had announced, his voice carrying the contemptuous tone that had become his trademark when addressing female officers. Real military operations require pilots who understand the difference between calculated risk and reckless endangerment. What you're proposing isn't heroic flying, it's suicide disguised as tactical planning. The room had fallen silent as Reeves continued his verbal assault, systematically dismantling Sarah's professional reputation in front of every senior officer on the base. Hurricane penetration requires physical strength and endurance that frankly exceed female physiological capabilities, he had declared, his words carefully chosen to sound like objective assessment rather than obvious prejudice. The control inputs necessary to maintain aircraft stability in Category 4 winds would exhaust most male pilots within 20 minutes. Expecting a woman to sustain that level of physical output for the duration of this mission is simply unrealistic. Other officers in the briefing room had shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but none had challenged Reeves's characterization of Sarah's proposal or his dismissive comments about female pilot capabilities. The institutional culture of military aviation still reflected decades of male dominance, where questioning a senior officer's judgment about pilot qualifications was considered inappropriate, regardless of how obviously wrong that judgment might be. Sarah had learned through bitter experience that defending herself against such attacks often backfired, making her appear emotional or unprofessional to observers who were already predisposed to question her competence. Major Patricia Hendricks, one of only 3 other female pilots assigned to Edwards, had caught Sarah's eye during Reeves's verbal attack with an expression that conveyed both sympathy and helpless frustration. Hendricks had faced similar discrimination throughout her own career, but had learned to navigate around prejudiced commanders rather than confronting them directly. The unspoken understanding between them was that challenging Reeves in public would likely result in negative fitness reports and blocked promotions that could destroy both their careers. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Stevens, the base's most experienced test pilot, had appeared visibly uncomfortable with Reeves's dismissal of Sarah's tactical analysis, but his body language suggested reluctance to contradict a superior officer's assessment. Stevens had flown with Sarah on several test missions and understood her exceptional capabilities better than most, but the political risks of defending a female pilot against accusations of physical inadequacy were too significant for him to accept. His silence represented the institutional cowardice that allowed discrimination to flourish even when clearly competent personnel were being marginalized. The meteorological briefing that followed had painted an increasingly grim picture of Hurricane Helena's development and the deteriorating situation on Platform Delta 7. Weather reconnaissance. Aircraft were reporting sustained winds exceeding 160 miles per hour in the storm's eye wall, with individual gusts approaching 200 miles per hour. That would challenge the structural integrity of any aircraft attempting penetration. The hurricane's forward motion had slowed dramatically, meaning that the platform would endure battering conditions for an extended period that exceeded its design specifications. Captain Robert Chun, the base's senior intelligence officer, had provided detailed information about the reconnaissance team's mission and current situation. The 6-person team led by Colonel Reeves had been conducting classified surveillance of suspected terrorist infiltration among offshore oil platform personnel, gathering intelligence that was considered critical to national security. Their extraction had been planned for a brief weather window that had closed when Hurricane Helena intensified more rapidly than meteorological models had predicted. Platform Delta 7 structural engineers had been transmitting increasingly alarming reports about the installation's condition as hurricane-force winds and massive waves subjected the structure to stresses that exceeded design parameters. Computer modeling indicated that several critical support numbers had sustained damage that compromised the platform's ability to withstand continued battering. Mathematical projections suggested complete structural failure within 18 hours, well before the hurricane would weaken sufficiently to allow conventional rescue operations. Sarah had listened to these updates with growing frustration as it became clear that every minute of delay reduced the chances of successful rescue while the trapped personnel situation became more desperate. Her experience with hurricane operations had taught her that storm systems like Helena contained brief periods of relative calm that could be exploited by pilots with sufficient skill and understanding of atmospheric dynamics. The key was recognizing these opportunities and acting decisively when they presented themselves. The alternative rescue proposals presented by other pilots had been tactically sound but temporally inadequate for the crisis timeline. Major Thompson had suggested waiting for the hurricane to pass and then conducting a standard search and rescue operation, ignoring the fact that Platform Delta 7 would have collapsed hours before such a mission could be launched. Captain Rodriguez had proposed using unmanned aerial vehicles to establish communication and deliver emergency supplies, an approach that might provide temporary relief but couldn't extract personnel from a collapsing structure. Colonel Reeves had dismissed each alternative proposal with the same authoritative tone he had used to reject Sarah's hurricane penetration plan, but his criticisms of the male pilots had been professionally worded and focused on tactical considerations rather than personal capabilities. The contrast in his treatment of male versus female officers was obvious to everyone present, but the institutional reluctance to challenge discriminatory behavior allowed such treatment to continue without formal consequences. As the briefing concluded with no viable rescue plan approved, Sarah had remained in her seat while other officers filed out of the room, discussing the impossible situation that was developing in the Gulf of Mexico. She understood that Colonel Reeves and his team were facing certain death unless someone was willing to attempt what the Air Force's senior leadership had declared impossible. The irony was bitter, the same pilot they considered inadequate for the mission might be their only hope for survival. The emergency klaxon began wailing across Edwards Air Force Base at 1847 hours, its piercing tone cutting through the desert evening as automated systems detected catastrophic changes in the Gulf of Mexico weather situation. Hurricane Helena had undergone explosive intensification during the previous 3 hours, transforming from a dangerous Category 4 storm into a monster Category 5 hurricane, with sustained winds now exceeding 185 miles per hour and pressure readings that shattered historical records for Gulf storms. Weather reconnaissance aircraft operating at the storm's periphery transmitted data that painted a picture of meteorological violence beyond anything in recorded history. The hurricane's eye wall had contracted to an unprecedented 18 miles in diameter, concentrating the storm's energy into a tight spiral of destruction that was generating wind speeds approaching the theoretical maximum for Atlantic Basin hurricanes. Satellite imagery showed a perfectly formed eye surrounded by towering thunderstorms that reached altitudes of over 60,000 feet, creating a vertical wall of atmospheric fury. Platform Delta 7's automated distress beacon began transmitting emergency signals that confirmed the installation's structural engineers' worst predictions about the platform's ability to survive hurricane conditions that exceeded all design parameters. The massive steel structure was experiencing resonant vibrations as hurricane-force winds interacted with the platform's superstructure, creating harmonic oscillations that threatened to tear the entire installation apart from within wave heights. exceeding 50 feet, were hammering the platform's support columns with forces that measured in thousands of tons per impact. The reconnaissance team's final coherent radio transmission had been received at 17:32 hours, consisting of Colonel Reeves's increasingly desperate voice reporting that multiple platform sections had suffered critical structural failures. Edwards Base, this is Recon Team Alpha. His transmission had crackled through atmospheric interference. We have complete failure of the eastern support matrix. The platform is listing approximately 15 degrees and taking on water through compromised hull sections. Estimate total structural collapse within 6 hours maximum. Subsequent communication attempts had produced only fragments of speech, interrupted by static and the sound of tearing metal as Hurricane Helena's assault on Platform Delta 7 intensified beyond the limits of what human engineering could withstand. The last identifiable words had been Reeves requesting immediate evacuation assistance, his voice carrying the kind of controlled panic that indicated a commander who finally understood that his decisions had placed 6 people in an impossible survival situation. Base meteorologist Captain Jennifer Walsh had been monitoring atmospheric conditions throughout the Gulf region, tracking Hurricane Helena's development with the kind of scientific fascination that competed with horror at the storm's unprecedented intensity. Her weather briefing to senior command staff painted a scenario where conventional rescue operations would be impossible for at least 48 hours, well beyond the timeline for Platform Delta 7's survival. Standard protocols called for waiting until wind speeds dropped below 60 miles per hour before launching helicopter rescue missions. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this content, please hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications. It really helps the channel grow. The physics of helicopter flight in Category 5 hurricane conditions involved forces that pushed aircraft design beyond theoretical limits established during certification testing. Rotor systems would experience asymmetric loading that could cause catastrophic blade failure, while fuselage structures would endure stress levels that exceeded ultimate load factors by significant margins. Control authority would be reduced to near zero as aerodynamic surfaces became ineffective in the chaotic airflow patterns created by hurricane-force winds. Flight Operations Officer Major David Kim had been calculating mission parameters for various rescue scenarios, each analysis confirming that standard Air Force helicopters lacked the performance characteristics necessary to operate in Helena's environment. The MH-60 Pavehawk helicopters assigned to Edwards possessed exceptional all-weather capabilities, but their operational limits stopped well short of Category 5 hurricane penetration. Even the most optimistic performance calculations indicated that attempting flight in current conditions would result in immediate loss of aircraft and crew, search and rescue coordination. Center personnel had been monitoring emergency frequencies throughout the Gulf region, receiving distress calls from multiple offshore installations as Hurricane Helena's expanded wind field affected platforms across hundreds of square miles. Platform Delta 7 represented only one of several installations experiencing critical structural damage, but it was the only location where military personnel were trapped with no possibility of evacuation. Using civilian rescue resources, Coast Guard commanders had been forced to suspend all search and rescue operations as Helena's intensity exceeded the operational limits of even their most capable aircraft and vessels. The service's legendary willingness to attempt rescues in extreme conditions had met its match in a storm system that threatened to destroy any aircraft foolish enough to venture into its path. Their MH-65 Dolphin helicopters, specifically designed for all-weather maritime operations, were grounded until conditions improved to manageable levels. Oil company emergency response teams had implemented complete evacuation procedures for all Gulf installations within Hurricane Helena's projected path, using the 24-hour warning period to remove non-essential personnel via helicopter shuttle operations. However, Platform Delta 7's reconnaissance mission had prevented such evacuation, leaving 6 military personnel trapped on an installation that civilian operators had abandoned 12 hours earlier when weather conditions were still manageable. Satellite communication links with Platform Delta 7 had been intermittently functional throughout the early evening, providing fragmentary updates about the installation's deteriorating condition and the reconnaissance team's increasingly desperate situation. Automated sensors indicated that platform sections were separating from the main structure, as welds failed under stress levels that exceeded their design specifications. The mathematical models were clear. Complete structural collapse was inevitable. Within hours, emergency response protocols developed by multiple agencies had been evaluated and found inadequate for the unique combination of extreme weather conditions and structural failure timeline that characterized the current crisis. Standard procedures assumed that either rescue could be attempted in manageable weather or that personnel could survive in protective structures until conditions improved. Platform Delta 7's situation violated both assumptions, creating a scenario where established emergency response doctrine provided no viable solutions. Air Force senior leadership had been conducting emergency teleconferences with Pentagon officials and National Weather Service administrators, seeking authorization for rescue attempts that would violate every safety regulation governing military aviation operations. The political implications of losing 6 Air Force personnel due to inadequate rescue capabilities competed with the liability concerns associated with authorizing missions that would almost certainly result in additional casualties among rescue personnel. Hurricane Helena's unprecedented intensity had attracted attention from atmospheric scientists worldwide, who were studying the storm's development to understand how climate patterns might be changing in ways that produced more extreme weather events. The scientific community's fascination with the hurricane's record-breaking characteristics provided little comfort to military planners, who needed immediate solutions rather than long-term research data about changing atmospheric conditions. Platform Delta 7's emergency power systems had begun failing as saltwater infiltration damaged electrical components throughout the installation, reducing the reconnaissance team's ability to maintain communication or operate survival equipment that might extend their endurance until rescue became possible. Battery-powered emergency beacons continued transmitting location data, but voice communication had become sporadic and increasingly difficult to understand through atmospheric interference. The timeline for potential rescue operations was compressing rapidly as both weather conditions and platform structural integrity deteriorated simultaneously, creating a narrowing window where successful mission completion remained theoretically possible while becoming practically impossible with each passing hour. Sarah stood in the hangar's equipment bay at 2,143 hours, methodically conducting pre-flight preparations on the MH-6 OTJ Hawk that represented her only chance of reaching Platform Delta 7 before its complete structural collapse. The decision to launch an unauthorized rescue mission had crystallized during the past hour as official channels continued to debate policy implications, while 6 Air Force personnel faced certain death in the Gulf of Mexico. She understood that her actions would likely result in court-martial proceedings, but the alternative was accepting preventable casualties due to institutional paralysis. The flight suit she donned contained specialized survival equipment designed for extreme maritime operations, including an integrated flotation system, emergency beacon, and medical supplies that could sustain life for extended periods in hostile environments. Her helmet incorporated advanced night vision systems and heads-up display, technology that would provide critical navigation information during flight through conditions where standard visual references would be impossible to maintain. Every piece of equipment had been selected for maximum utility in scenarios where equipment failure meant immediate death. Weather data streaming into the Base Operations Center continued to paint an increasingly grim Picture of Hurricane Helena's intensity and Platform Delta 7's deteriorating structural condition. The latest reconnaissance reports indicated that the hurricane's eye wall had contracted further, concentrating wind speeds into a tight spiral that was generating sustained velocities exceeding 190 miles per hour. Pressure readings from the storm's center had dropped to levels that challenged the accuracy of measurement. Instruments designed for extreme weather monitoring. Flight planning for hurricane penetration required calculations that pushed beyond normal aviation parameters into theoretical territory where standard performance charts provided no guidance. Sarah had spent 2 hours developing a mission profile that exploited brief windows of relative stability between the hurricane's most violent spiral bands, timing her approach to coincide with temporary lulls in wind velocity that occurred as the storm's structure evolved. Her route would require flying at altitudes below 100 feet to avoid the most destructive wind shear while maintaining sufficient power reserves for emergency maneuvering. The MH-60T Jayhawk she had selected for the mission represented the pinnacle of all-weather helicopter technology, incorporating design modifications that enhance survivability in extreme environmental conditions. The aircraft's engines had been upgraded with particle separation systems that could continue operating despite ingesting massive quantities of salt spray and debris, while the rotor system featured advanced blade designs that maintained effectiveness in asymmetric loading conditions that would destroy conventional helicopters. Navigation through Hurricane Helena would require constant reference to specialized weather radar systems that could penetrate precipitation cores and identify areas of relative atmospheric stability within the storm's chaotic structure. Sarah had programmed multiple GPS waypoints that would guide her through the hurricane's spiral bands, while avoiding embedded supercells capable of generating downdrafts exceeding 4,000 feet per minute. Her flight path resembled a complex maze, designed to exploit brief gaps in the storm's most lethal characteristics. Fuel calculations for the rescue mission indicated that she would be operating with minimal reserves, requiring precise power management throughout the flight to ensure sufficient endurance for both the transit to Platform Delta 7 and the return journey with rescued personnel. The weight of 6 additional passengers would significantly reduce the helicopter's performance margins, forcing her to modify her return route to account for decreased climb capability and increased susceptibility to turbulence-induced control problems. Communication with Platform Delta 7 had become increasingly sporadic as the installation's electrical systems failed under the combined assault of saltwater infiltration and structural vibration that was shaking the platform apart from within. The reconnaissance team's last coherent transmission had indicated that several personnel were injured and that the platform's helicopter landing pad had sustained damage that would complicate any rescue attempt. Colonel Reeves's voice had carried barely controlled desperation as he described platform sections separating from the main structure. The helicopter's cargo bay had been configured for maximum passenger capacity while maintaining essential medical equipment that might be needed to treat injured personnel during the return flight. Sarah had removed non-essential components to reduce weight while installing additional tie-down points that would secure rescued personnel during flight through severe turbulence. Her medical kit contained trauma supplies designed for treating injuries commonly associated with structural collapse and saltwater exposure. Advanced flight control systems integrated into the Jayhawk provided automated stability augmentation that would be essential for maintaining aircraft control during hurricane penetration operations. The helicopter's fly-by-wire technology could make control adjustments faster than human reflexes, compensating for wind gusts and turbulence that would overwhelm manual piloting techniques. However, these systems had never been tested in conditions approaching Helena's intensity, making the mission an experimental flight test with life-or-death consequences. Platform Delta 7 structural engineers had transmitted final damage assessments indicating that the installation's collapse was imminent, with mathematical models suggesting complete failure within 3 hours as resonant vibrations reached critical amplitudes. The platform's emergency beacon continued transmitting location data, but automated sensors indicated that several support columns had suffered fractures that were propagating through the structure's steel framework. Each successive wave impact was enlarging these cracks until they would reach the point where catastrophic failure became inevitable. Weather reconnaissance aircraft operating at the hurricane's periphery reported that Helena's eye wall was approaching platform Delta 7's position, meaning that wind conditions at the platform would reach maximum intensity within 2 hours. The eye wall passage would subject the installation to the most extreme forces in the hurricane's arsenal, virtually guaranteeing structural collapse unless evacuation occurred during the brief window before the storm's most violent phase arrived at the platform's coordinates. Sarah's civilian experience with hurricane research flights had taught her to recognize atmospheric patterns that indicated temporary stability within storm systems, knowledge that she would apply to identify safe corridors through Helena's spiral bands. Her understanding of hurricane dynamics suggested that the storm's rapid intensification might create structural irregularities that could be exploited by a pilot with sufficient experience in extreme weather operations. These gaps in the hurricane's defenses would be brief and unpredictable, requiring split-second decision-making and precise aircraft control. The base's senior leadership remained locked in emergency conferences with Pentagon officials, debating authorization procedures for rescue missions that violated established safety protocols. While time continued to expire for the trapped reconnaissance team, Sarah understood that official approval would never come in time to matter, leaving her with the choice between following regulations that condemned 6 people to death or violating orders to save lives that regulations couldn't protect. Emergency radio frequencies carried increasingly desperate transmissions from platform Delta 7 as structural failures accelerated throughout the installation's framework, with Colonel Reeves describing the sound of tearing metal and the platform's alarming list as support columns buckled under hurricane force loading. His professional composure was cracking under the stress of watching his command decisions result in imminent death for personnel who had trusted his leadership. The flight line stretched empty, except for the single Jayhawk that Sarah had prepared for launch, its rotor blades secured against the desert wind while Hurricane Helena continued its assault on the Gulf Coast hundreds of miles away. She completed her final equipment checks with the methodical precision of a pilot who understood that attention to detail often determined survival margins in extreme conditions. Every switch position and instrument reading had been verified twice, leaving nothing to chance in a mission where mechanical failure would be immediately fatal. The rescue mission launched at 2,247 hours, under a clear desert sky that contrasted starkly with the meteorological violence awaiting Sarah Martinez 700 miles southeast over the Gulf of Mexico. Her MH-60T Jayhawk lifted off from Edwards Air Force Base without official authorization, its departure monitored by base personnel, who understood they were witnessing either an act of heroic determination or a tragic example of how good pilots made fatal decisions when emotion overruled judgment. Flight time to Platform Delta 7 would consume nearly 4 hours through increasingly hostile atmospheric conditions, as Sarah navigated from the California desert to the heart of Hurricane Helena's fury. Her route followed established air corridors until reaching the Louisiana coast, where she would begin the most dangerous phase of the mission by penetrating the hurricane's outer bands and threading her way through wind patterns that could destroy her aircraft within seconds if encountered at the wrong altitude or angle. The first 2 hours of flight passed over familiar terrain where Sarah had conducted countless training missions during her assignment to Edwards, allowing her to focus on fuel management calculations and weather monitoring while the helicopter's autopilot maintained course toward the Gulf Coast. Navigation displays showed Hurricane Helene as a massive spiral of destruction, covering hundreds of square miles. Its eye positioned directly over platform Delta 7's coordinates with mathematical precision that suggested the storm was personally targeting the installation. Communication with platform Delta 7 became intermittently possible as Sarah's aircraft approached the hurricane's periphery, revealing that Colonel Revs and his reconnaissance team were experiencing the final stages of structural collapse that would end their lives within the next hour. Automated distress beacons continued transmitting location data, but voice communications were fragmentary due to electrical system failures and the overwhelming noise of hurricane-force winds tearing the platform apart piece by piece. Penetration of Helene's outer spiral bands at 0147 hours subjected Sarah's helicopter to turbulence levels that exceeded anything she had previously experienced during her extensive career in extreme weather operations. The aircraft's advanced flight control systems struggled to maintain stability as wind conditions changed from moment to moment, requiring constant manual adjustments to power settings and flight attitude that pushed her physical endurance toward its limits. Instrument readings fluctuated wildly as the helicopter encountered wind shear that could have torn apart less robust aircraft. Navigation through the hurricane's spiral structure required following a constantly changing path between areas of maximum wind velocity and embedded supercells that generated localized tornadoes, capable of destroying any aircraft unfortunate enough to encounter them. Sarah's route resembled a complex maze that exploited brief gaps in the storm's defenses, timing her movements to coincide with temporary lulls in atmospheric violence that lasted only minutes before conditions deteriorated beyond aircraft survival limits. The approach to Platform Delta 7 revealed the full extent of structural damage that Hurricane Helene had inflicted on the installation during 6 hours of continuous battering by wind and waves that exceeded all engineering design parameters. Massive sections of the platform's superstructure had been torn away by hurricane-force winds, while the main deck listed at a dangerous angle that indicated imminent complete collapse. Emergency lighting flickered sporadically through the storm's fury, providing brief glimpses of an installation that was moments away from total destruction. Landing on the platform's damaged helicopter pad required precision flying that pushed Sarah's skills to their absolute limits as she compensated for wind conditions that changed direction and velocity every few seconds while maneuvering around debris and damaged structures that could destroy her rotor blades if contacted during the approach. The helicopter's engines struggled to maintain power output in the salt-laden atmosphere while rotor systems endured asymmetric loading that created vibrations throughout the aircraft structure. Colonel Reeves emerged from the platform's emergency shelter with an expression that combined relief, amazement, and the hollow stare of a man who had accepted his own death before witnessing an impossible rescue. His reconnaissance team included 2 personnel with serious injuries sustained during structural collapses, requiring immediate medical attention that Sarah provided while coordinating their evacuation to the helicopter under conditions where standing upright was nearly impossible due to hurricane-force winds. Loading 6 additional passengers into the helicopter's cargo bay required rapid reorganization of equipment and careful weight distribution to maintain the aircraft's center of gravity within acceptable limits for flight in extreme turbulence. Sarah's medical training proved essential as she stabilized injured personnel, while explaining evacuation procedures to team members who were struggling with disorientation caused by hours of exposure to noise levels and motion that exceeded human endurance capabilities. The departure from Platform Delta 7 occurred just as the installation's main support structure began its final collapse, with Sarah lifting off seconds before massive steel beams crashed into the helicopter landing pad where her aircraft had been positioned moments earlier. Her timing had been perfect through a combination of skill, experience, and mathematical precision that allowed her to extract 6 lives from a situation where survival had seemed impossible according to every expert assessment. Return flight. Through Hurricane Helena's spiral bands required modified techniques to accommodate the additional weight and changed performance characteristics of the heavily loaded helicopter. Sarah's route planning had accounted for reduced climb capability and increased fuel consumption, but the reality of flying through Category 5 winds with injured passengers proved even more demanding than her calculations had predicted. Every control input required maximum physical effort as she fought to maintain aircraft stability through atmospheric conditions that challenged the structural limits of her helicopter. Navigation back to Edwards Air Force Base consumed 5 hours. Through gradually improving weather conditions, as Sarah's aircraft emerged from the hurricane's influence and crossed the Louisiana coast into more manageable atmospheric environments. Her passengers included Colonel Reeves, who remained silent throughout most of the flight while contemplating how his career-long prejudices had nearly resulted in his death, and the deaths of 5 people under his command. Medical treatment of injured personnel during the return flight required Sarah to coordinate patient care while maintaining aircraft control through continued turbulence that made any movement within the helicopter dangerous for both patients and crew. Her emergency medical training proved invaluable as she stabilized trauma injuries and managed pain medication dosages that kept injured team members conscious and responsive during the extended evacuation flight. Landing at Edwards Air Force Base at 0721 hours concluded a rescue mission that had violated every safety regulation governing military aviation while successfully extracting 6 lives from certain death. Ground crews and medical personnel were waiting to receive the rescued reconnaissance team, their faces reflecting amazement that Sarah had accomplished what senior leadership had declared impossible due to weather conditions and operational constraints. Colonel Reeves was transported to the base medical facility for treatment of minor injuries and observation for exposure-related complications, but his most serious wounds were psychological rather than physical. His confidence in his own judgment and his beliefs about pilot capabilities had been shattered by a mission that proved how completely wrong his assessments had been about both weather flying and female aviator competence. The investigation that followed would examine every aspect of Sarah's unauthorized rescue mission, analyzing flight data and weather conditions to understand how she had accomplished seemingly impossible aerial navigation through Hurricane Helena's fury. Her success would eventually lead to modifications in emergency response protocols and recognition that extreme weather operations required specialized skills that transcended traditional assumptions about pilot capabilities based on gender or physical characteristics. The investigation board convened at Edwards Air Force Base 3 weeks after Hurricane Helena's passage, assembled in the same briefing room where Colonel Reeves had publicly dismissed Sarah's tactical capabilities as inadequate for extreme weather operations. The panel consisted of senior officers from multiple commands, including General Patricia Morrison from Air Combat Command, who had flown combat missions during the Gulf War and understood the difference between calculated risk and reckless endangerment. The investigation's scope encompassed not only Sarah's unauthorized rescue mission, but also the command decisions that had created the crisis requiring such extreme measures. General Morrison opened the proceedings by acknowledging the unprecedented nature of the situation that had developed during Hurricane Helena's assault on Platform Delta 7, Captain Martinez. She began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded flight operations in hostile environments. Your actions during the night of October 15th violated multiple Air Force regulations regarding unauthorized aircraft operations and flight safety protocols. However, those same actions resulted in the successful rescue of 6 Air Force personnel who would have died without your intervention. The hearing room contained every senior officer stationed at Edwards, along with representatives from the Pentagon's Aviation Safety Office, and the National Hurricane Center, who had been studying Sarah's flight through Hurricane Helena to understand how such navigation had been possible under conditions that exceeded all established operational limits. Meteorologist Dr. Rebecca Chen presented atmospheric data that confirmed wind speeds during Sarah's mission had reached levels that should have made helicopter flight impossible using conventional techniques. Colonel Reeves sat at the far end of the witness table. His appearance dramatically changed from the confident officer who had dismissed female pilot capabilities just weeks earlier. His experience on Platform Delta 7 had left him with a hollow expression that suggested someone whose fundamental beliefs about leadership and competence had been shattered by events that proved how completely wrong his assessments had been. The man who had spent years undermining Sarah's professional reputation now faced the reality that his own survival had depended entirely on skills he had declared inadequate. The flight data recorder from Sarah's helicopter had captured every aspect of her navigation through Hurricane Helena, providing scientific documentation of flying techniques that pushed beyond established performance parameters into theoretical territory where standard aviation knowledge offered no guidance. The recorded information showed control inputs and power management decisions that demonstrated mastery of helicopter operations under conditions that would have been fatal for pilots without her specialized training and experience. Major General David Patterson, the Air Force's senior test pilot, had reviewed the mission data with amazement that bordered on disbelief. "Captain Martinez," he testified, "your flight through Category 5 hurricane conditions represents flying that exceeds anything in our training curriculum or operational experience. The control precision required to maintain aircraft stability in those wind conditions suggests pilot skills that place you among the most capable aviators in military service." Sarah's response to the investigation board was delivered with the same professional composure that had characterized her military career despite years of discrimination and official neglect. "General Morrison, my actions were based on the assessment that 6 Air Force personnel faced certain death unless someone was willing to attempt what regulations declared impossible. My experience with extreme weather operations indicated that Hurricane Helena contained brief windows of atmospheric stability that could be exploited by appropriate flying techniques." The testimony revealed that Sarah's unauthorized mission had succeeded because she possessed a unique combination of skills that no other pilot at Edwards could match. Her civilian experience with hurricane research flights had provided understanding of storm dynamics that was unavailable through standard military training, while her background in offshore emergency operations had taught her navigation techniques specifically designed for maritime rescue under extreme weather conditions. Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the National Hurricane Center presented analysis showing that Sarah's route through Hurricane Helena had exploited atmospheric phenomena that meteorologists were still struggling to understand. Captain Martinez identified and utilized temporary stability zones within the hurricane structure that our computer models had not predicted, Dr. Walsh explained. Her successful navigation suggests pilot intuition and weather reading abilities that exceed our current scientific understanding of hurricane dynamics. The investigation also examined the command decisions that had created the Platform Delta 7 crisis, revealing that Colonel Reeves had ignored weather warnings and refused to consider alternative mission timelines that could have avoided exposing his reconnaissance team to hurricane conditions. His insistence on conducting operations, despite deteriorating weather, had reflected the same risk-averse mindset that prioritized career advancement over personnel safety throughout his military service. Lieutenant Colonel Stevens, who had remained silent during the original mission briefing when Reeves dismissed Sarah's tactical input, now testified about the technical superiority of her hurricane penetration plan compared to alternatives that had been presented. Captain Martinez's analysis was the only proposal that accurately assessed both the weather, timeline and the platform's structural limitations, he admitted. Her approach would have prevented the crisis entirely if it had been implemented when originally suggested. The panel's examination of Sarah's service record revealed a pattern of exceptional performance that had been consistently undervalued by commanders who allowed prejudice to override objective assessment of pilot capabilities. Her training records showed qualifications and experience that exceeded most senior officers in the room. Yet her professional advancement had been blocked by systematic discrimination that prevented recognition of her actual competence. General Morrison addressed the broader implications of the investigation's findings with the kind of institutional honesty that characterized military leaders who prioritized mission effectiveness over political considerations. This incident reveals fundamental problems in how we assess pilot capabilities and make command decisions during crisis situations. Captain Martinez possessed exactly the skills needed to resolve this emergency, yet she was excluded from mission planning because of assumptions that proved completely wrong. Colonel Reeves was called to provide testimony about his decision-making during both the original mission planning and the platform crisis that had nearly resulted in his death. His statement was delivered in the monotone voice of an officer whose confidence in his own judgment had been permanently shattered by events that exposed his limitations. "I was wrong about Captain Martinez's capabilities," he admitted. "My assessment was based on prejudice rather than professional evaluation, and that prejudice nearly cost 6 lives." The medical personnel who had treated the rescued reconnaissance team provided testimony about the injuries that had been sustained during Platform Delta 7's structural collapse and the professional medical care they had received during Sarah's evacuation flight. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, the base's senior flight surgeon, confirmed that Sarah's emergency medical treatment had been properly executed under conditions that would have challenged experienced trauma surgeons working in fully equipped hospitals. Sarah's explanation of her decision to launch an unauthorized rescue mission reflected the moral reasoning that had guided her actions throughout the crisis. The choice was between following regulations that would result in preventable deaths or violating orders to save lives that regulations couldn't protect, she stated. "My oath as an Air Force officer includes responsibility to preserve life when possible, and that responsibility transcended procedural compliance in this situation." The investigation board's final deliberations consumed 2 days as senior officers wrestled with the precedent implications of either punishing or rewarding actions that had violated regulations while achieving mission success under impossible conditions. The panel's decision would influence Air Force policy regarding emergency response operations and establish guidelines for situations where standard procedures proved inadequate for evolving circumstances. General Morrison announced the board's findings with the kind of institutional courage that separated exceptional military leaders from bureaucratic administrators. Captain Martinez will be promoted to major and awarded the Air Force Cross for extraordinary heroism during aerial operations under conditions that exceeded all established safety parameters. She will also be assigned to command the Air Force's new Extreme Weather Operations Squadron, where her expertise will be used to develop tactics and training for emergency response in extreme environmental conditions. The promotion ceremony took place 6 weeks later in the same hangar where Sarah had prepared for her unauthorized rescue mission, with the MH-6 OT Jayhawk that had carried her through Hurricane Helena serving as backdrop for recognition that had been earned through competence rather than politics. The assembled audience included pilots from throughout the Air Force who had come to witness the vindication of an aviator whose skills had finally received the recognition they deserved. Colonel Reeves attended the ceremony as a private citizen, having submitted his retirement request immediately following the investigation board's findings. His presence represented an acknowledgement of how completely his prejudices had been proven wrong by events that exposed the difference between assumed limitations and actual capabilities. His career had ended not because of the Platform Delta 7 Crisis. But because of the discriminatory leadership that had created conditions where such crises became inevitable. Major. Sarah Martinez stood before the assembled audience wearing the silver oak leaves of her new rank and the distinctive ribbon of the Air Force Cross, representing validation that had required a decade to achieve through demonstration rather than politics. Her assignment to command the Extreme Weather Operations Squadron would allow her to train other pilots in techniques that she had developed through years of civilian experience and military excellence that had been systematically undervalued by institutional prejudice. The story of Hurricane Helena rescue would become legendary throughout military aviation circles, studied in flight schools and staff colleges as an example of how individual competence could triumph over institutional limitations when moral courage combined with technical expertise to save lives that regulations couldn't protect. Sarah's success had proven that strength and capability came in forms that traditional military culture had failed to recognize or properly utilize. Young female aviators throughout the Air Force now had an example of what was possible when determination, combined with exceptional skill to overcome barriers that others considered insurmountable. The message was clear. Sometimes the person everyone underestimates becomes the hero when circumstances demand the kind of courage and competence that transcends conventional assumptions about who possesses the capabilities needed for impossible missions. What incredible display of courage have you witnessed that completely changed someone's assumptions about what was possible? Share your story in the comments below, and if this tale of determination triumphing over prejudice inspired you, hit that subscribe button to join our community of people who believe that heroes emerge when competence meets opportunity regardless of what others might expect. Ring the notification bell so you never miss these powerful stories that prove the human spirit can overcome any obstacle when guided by skill, courage, and the determination to do what's right. 5 years after Hurricane Helena, Major Sarah Phoenix Martinez stood before a packed auditorium at the Air Force Academy, addressing the largest class of female cadets in the institution's history. Her weathered flight suit bore the patches of the Extreme Weather Operations Squadron she now commanded, while the Air Force Cross on her chest caught the auditorium lights as she prepared to share lessons that had been written in hurricane winds and validated through missions that others had declared impossible. The cadets in the audience represented a new generation of military aviators who had grown up hearing stories about the pilot who had flown through a Category 5 hurricane to rescue personnel that regulations couldn't save. Her legend had spread throughout aviation circles worldwide, inspiring not only American military pilots but also civilian emergency responders who studied her techniques for operating aircraft under conditions that challenged the boundaries of what was considered survivable. Sarah's Extreme Weather Operations Squadron had become the Air Force's premier unit for emergency response in environmental conditions that grounded conventional aircraft, conducting rescue missions during tornadoes, blizzards, and severe thunderstorms that would have been considered impossible before her techniques were developed into standardized procedures. The squadron's success rate in extreme weather operations exceeded 90%, with mission profiles that routinely pushed beyond established safety parameters, while maintaining acceptable risk levels through superior training and equipment modifications. The training curriculum she had developed incorporated lessons learned from her civilian experience with hurricane research flights, offshore emergency operations, and mountain rescue techniques that emphasized reading environmental conditions rather than simply following procedural checklists. Her students learned to understand weather patterns as dynamic systems that could be navigated through skill and experience rather than avoided through regulatory compliance that prioritized institutional liability over mission accomplishment. Colonel James Reeves had spent his retirement years working as a civilian aviation safety consultant, dedicating his post-military career to identifying and eliminating the kind of institutional prejudices that had nearly cost him his life during Hurricane Helena. His transformation from a discriminatory commander to an advocate for merit-based personnel evaluation had become a case study in military leadership programs worldwide, demonstrating how personal experience could fundamentally change perspectives that had been shaped by decades of unchallenged assumptions. The platform rescue mission had revolutionized Air Force emergency response doctrine, establishing new protocols for operations in extreme weather conditions that balanced acceptable risk against mission necessity through careful analysis of pilot capabilities and environmental factors. Sarah's success had proven that impossible missions often became possible when the right combination of skills, experience, and determination was applied to problems that conventional thinking couldn't solve. Her speaking engagements at military installations throughout the country consistently drew capacity audiences of pilots who wanted to understand how extreme weather flying techniques could be applied to their own operational specialties. The principles she taught extended beyond aviation into broader concepts of leadership under pressure, decision-making in crisis situations, and the importance of recognizing individual capabilities that might not conform to traditional institutional expectations. The Hurricane Helene rescue had also influenced civilian emergency response procedures, with the Federal Emergency Management Agency incorporating Sarah's weather penetration techniques into training programs for emergency services pilots who operated during natural disasters. Her methods had been adapted for use with various aircraft types, from law enforcement helicopters conducting search and rescue operations during severe storms to medical evacuation aircraft serving remote locations where weather conditions frequently challenged conventional flight operations. Research institutions had studied the atmospheric data recorded during Sarah's flight through Hurricane Helene, using her navigation techniques to develop improved weather forecasting models that better predicted the brief stability windows that could be exploited for emergency operations. The National Hurricane Center had incorporated her observations into computer simulations that enhanced understanding of hurricane dynamics and improved the accuracy of storm intensity predictions. The Air Force's approach to pilot evaluation had undergone comprehensive revision following the investigation into Sarah's unauthorized rescue mission, establishing new assessment criteria that emphasized demonstrated performance under pressure rather than assumptions based on physical characteristics or traditional career progression patterns. The changes had resulted in more diverse pilot assignments and improved mission success rates across all aviation specialties. Sarah's autobiography, titled Through the Storm: Lessons in Leadership and Extreme Weather Flying, had become required reading at military leadership schools worldwide, providing detailed analysis of decision-making processes during high-stress situations where conventional procedures proved inadequate for evolving circumstances. The book's technical appendices included flight procedures and weather analysis techniques that had been adopted by aviation organizations throughout the international community. The Extreme Weather Operations Squadron had expanded from its original focus on hurricane operations to include Arctic rescue missions, high-altitude evacuations, and emergency response during volcanic eruptions and other natural disasters that created atmospheric conditions exceeding normal aircraft operational limits. Squadron pilots had successfully completed missions in environments ranging from Antarctic blizzards to Middle Eastern sandstorms that would have grounded conventional aviation units. Training partnerships with international military organizations had spread Sarah's extreme weather flying techniques to allied nations facing similar emergency response challenges, creating a global network of pilots capable of conducting rescue operations under conditions that had previously been considered beyond aircraft survival limits. The program's success had enhanced America's reputation for technical innovation in aviation, while providing humanitarian assistance capabilities that strengthened diplomatic relationships worldwide. Private aerospace companies had recruited several of Sarah's former students to develop Civilian applications for extreme weather flying techniques, including emergency medical services in remote regions, offshore oil platform safety operations, and search and rescue capabilities for mountaineering and wilderness recreation areas where weather conditions frequently challenged conventional helicopter operations. That the legacy of Hurricane Helene extended beyond aviation into broader military culture, where Sarah's story had become an example of how individual moral courage could triumph over institutional inertia when supported by exceptional professional competence. Her success had inspired policy changes in multiple service branches, establishing precedents for recognizing and utilizing capabilities that might not conform to traditional expectations about military personnel. Young pilots throughout the air force now trained with the understanding that extreme conditions could be survived and missions could be accomplished through proper preparation, superior skill development, and the willingness to push beyond comfort zones when circumstances demanded exceptional performance. The culture of innovation that Sarah had helped establish encouraged creative, problem-solving approaches that had improved mission success rates across all operational specialties. The Hurricane Helene rescue had been studied by leadership schools worldwide as an example of how crisis situations could reveal both individual character and institutional weaknesses, providing lessons that applied to civilian organizations facing similar challenges in recognizing and utilizing human potential that might be overlooked by conventional assessment methods. As Sarah concluded her presentation to the Air Force Academy cadets, she emphasized the fundamental principle that had guided her career: competence and determination mattered more than conventional expectations about who possessed the capabilities needed for impossible missions. Her final words resonated throughout the auditorium as she reminded the future officers that sometimes the person everyone underestimated would become the hero when circumstances demanded. Courage guided by skill and moral conviction. The standing ovation that followed lasted several minutes, with cadets understanding they had witnessed testimony from someone whose actions had fundamentally changed military aviation, while proving that individual excellence could overcome any institutional barrier when applied with sufficient determination and professional competence. What extraordinary moment have you witnessed where someone completely shattered expectations and achieved the impossible? Share your inspiring story in the comments below. We read every single one, and your experiences could inspire millions. If this incredible tale of courage overcoming prejudice moved you, smash that subscribe button and join our community of over 2 million people who believe that heroes come in all forms. Hit the notification bell to never miss these powerful stories that prove the human spirit can conquer any storm when guided by skill, determination, and unwavering moral courage.